Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the third album from a guy called Gerald, 28 Gun Bad Boy! Alright then, so, Gerald's first two albums may have been pretty similar in sound and approach, still showing house music in its early stages and helping form it into the kind of style and sound we associate with house, especially in the 90s. But Gerald is not the kind of artist who likes sticking with just one style. He's an artist who's continually reinvented himself and pushed himself into new territory, sometimes into territory that may be familiar to us now, but certainly wasn't that level of familiar at the time of its release. Now, given the general direction of Automanic, he probably wasn't going to be able to reinvent himself much while still working with Columbia, who no doubt just wanted him to keep pushing out the same stuff. So he just dropped off of Columbia and started his own label called Juicebox, starting a new phase of his career. And this third album takes us to the very beginnings of a completely different genre, pioneering a style that we now recognize as drum and bass. Well, it wasn't called that at the time. Back then, this was called jungle music. And okay, I know the two genres aren't exactly one and the same, but drum and bass most definitely grew out of what jungle started, and we'll get more into that with other projects of his. But yeah, this album shows some of the first music ever made in that particular style. Now, it may be true by the time this album actually released in 1993, the jungle genre had been a little better established, but a lot of this project compiles together a bunch of tracks from singles and EPs he'd released back in 1991 and 92, back in the days when even The Prodigy hadn't put together their first album yet. Though it wasn't an adjacent scene to artists like them. Like, this project takes a lot of cues from surrounding scenes, most notably in hardcore and breakbeat. Probably would have been filed more under those scenes at the time. Though the particular way he manipulates the breakbeat wasn't quite as, like, heavy and hard-hitting as stuff like The Prodigy or maybe Outakker's Cavity Job. The breakbeats here tend to be thinner and more brittle sounding, kind of more like something you'd hear out of really early Square Pusher, but before he'd even released anything of his own. This project, while it may be kind of a product of its time, was also noticeably ahead of its time. Back when this stuff was dropping, there wasn't much out there quite like it. As for how well it holds up by a 2020 perspective, yeah, it's still a lot of fun stuff here. It does really help to know its place in history. Like I said, this project was still a product of its time, and a lot of the sounds and approaches on display here may seem kind of primitive and dated by today's standards. A project like this straight up wouldn't even fit in the electronic music landscape nowadays. Like, people don't really make stuff that sounds like this much anymore. The particular approach he went about here is so easily tied to the early 90s. There are a few elements of this project that I find didn't age super well. Most notably the production and how shrill and sharp and treble heavy everything sounds. It's not the greatest sounding project you've ever heard. And a few of the sample sources are a little iffy, like most notably that one sample on Money Honey that presents talking to random women being like hunting wildlife. I get the feeling that was kind of more like a joke, but it's kind of cringy. But aside from that, honestly, I found that a lot of this project's original appeal still stands. These tracks are still fun and exciting in spite of their brittle and tinny production, the way all these random vocal snippets are worked directly into the grooves and breakbeats on every track and helps drive them even further. There's a lot of really solid hooks and melodies created here too. A lot of this project kind of follows the formula and maybe can run together a little bit. Not the kind of thing that merits super in-depth listening and analysis. It's not deep, but it never was trying to be. Now, in terms of individual tracks, just taking a cursory glance at the track listing, there's one track here that looks like it'd be a big standout right from the get-go. The 17-minute opener, Mix. A medley of 8 different tracks, mostly previously released from old singles, but segued smoothly together so that they basically form one big epic mega track. And yeah, it's about as good as you would expect. Unsurprisingly, this is probably the highlight of the album for me. Like, each of the 8 tracks can be individually recognized, but they often, like, play directly over each other and combine their elements together, end up really making them all feel like they're parts of the same overarching whole. Like the best continuous mixes do. I mean, sure, some segments pop out a lot more than others. For instance, starting the project with a track built around the ominous voice sample of "Cops don't like me, so I don't like cops." has felt particularly resonant as of late. And most of the tracks in this mix are named after their pretty easily recognizable vocal samples. I also found the track Sunshine to be a particular standout in the mix. That yelping, pitched-up sample is among the catchiest on the whole album. Alright, 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 in the sunshine. The Bandcamp release even includes that track out of context as like a bonus track, though I don't think it hits quite as hard by itself as it does in the context of the 17-minute mix. There are some tracks in the beginning that aren't as easy to recognize, namely the tracks Anything and the title track, 28 Gun Bad Boy, which blend into the mix so seamlessly that I often don't even notice they're there. But they certainly are among the most hard-hitting and percussive moments of the mix. And the title track is also included out of context in the main bulk of the album, and that's cool too. Certainly is easier to recognize that way, and is a pretty fun little hard-hitting track there. As for other tracks on here, they range in quality. All of them kind of follow the same formula and don't give me a ton to say, but all of them are fun. The kind of obnoxious attitude behind the sample on Money Honey ended up mattering less and less to me the more I listened to it. I mean, at the end of the day, it's really not about what's being said. It's about the way the samples are chopped up and amplify the groove, which is really solid, and like the synth pads and little horn stabs and flute riffs are fun enough to make up for it. The breaks on Got a Feeling are pretty standard and now pretty damn overused, but still working the way they always have. And the titular sample is a mood. Got a feeling that I wanna die. Universe 2000 has like this weird tacked on piano and vocal sample intro that doesn't sound anything like the main bulk of the track, and its transition into the actual track is really abrupt and off-putting. But once the track gets going, you're treated to like watery progressions of synth pads, blubbering bass lines, a wavering sample of someone yelling, "Yeah!" and a loop of what sounds like steel drums playing over a telephone over the usual banging mix of breaks. The track, meanwhile, is one of the biggest bangers here. All of these breaks have a lot more heaviness to them and a real thumping quality to them, as the weird humming sample and choppy abrasive chords punctuate the groove. That one's a lot of fun. Forever Changing has a really similar sounding intro to Universe 2000 that also doesn't sound anything like the main bulk of the track. And the mix of this one also sounds pretty similar to that track as well. I do quite like the way like the bass line just stabs through the mix of banging breaks and Pacific State-like pads. And there's even some acid synths on this one for good measure. Always nice. I'm not huge on some of the vocal snippets on this one though. Like there's these kind of lethargic moaning vocals in the background of this one that kind of bring down the energy that this track could have had otherwise. And then there's another sample that says, "Hump daddy motherfucker," that pops up sometimes, and it was a little annoying and felt kind of out of place. But these aren't so distracting that they make me want to like skip the track either. It's still pretty good. The Freak Inside has this sample from the movie RoboCop in the intro that's pretty fun and fits with the album cover there. Though this was probably the least interesting track in the bunch. Otherwise, the bass line's kind of muted, the breaks are kind of skittery and don't really bang as hard as other tracks on here. And there isn't even much of a melody here either. The vocal snippets on this one are pretty fun though, and they can make up for the core groove feeling kind of underweight. Party people, let me see if we can dance! And the last two tracks are definitely two of the biggest highlights, much more melodic and atmospheric leaning stuff that sort of hint at the direction he'd end up going on his next album. Disneyband combines its bubbly bass line, subtle organ synthplex, and airy pads with maybe a little trumpet solo occasionally. That one sounds really nice. And Wonderful World recontextualizes someone covering the Louis Armstrong track into a totally different sounding tune, with all these screeching 90s jock jam stabs going over these mystical pad progressions and some deep house pianos, and one of the heaviest and most banging breaks in the bunch as well, really closing this project on a strong note. So yeah, that's 28 Gun Bad Boy. I was going off and on between whether I thought this album was great or just really good. It's like right on that border between the 7 and 8 ranges for me, I would say. I mean, it's not like I don't have my issues, ignoring the fact that many of these breakbeats are ones that you've probably heard a million times by now. They obviously weren't even as close to as overused back in 1993. But, I mean, yeah, the tinny production did kind of get to me on some listens. Some of these samples, like I said, sound like they're being played over a telephone and don't sound very good. And also, as I mentioned before, this project can kind of fall into the background for me. Like, when I do really pay attention, I don't find so much mind-blowing stuff that I feel like it really merits that type of deeper look. But by the same token, you really don't need to listen super closely to get the appeal of a project like this. It's just trying to deliver a whole bunch of bangers and have fun with drum loops in a way that was pretty novel for the time, and now has become kind of like the grander tradition for these genres, I guess. I feel like any misgivings I might have had are kind of overrun by my respect for its place in history, and those misgivings are already much less pronounced than they are on a project like, say, New Build, which I still mostly respect for its place in history than I particularly love coming back to. Say what you will about this project, you can't deny it still bangs. The hooks are good, the melodies are good, the breakbeats hit hard. It wasn't aiming super high, but it definitely accomplished everything it set out to do and ended up with a listening experience that still stands up as its own thing to this day. Not deep, but still a lot of fun that mostly transcends its inherent datedness. And, I think I can let it just get away with a solid 8 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.